wanted to apologize to Leon that we scheduled him so late because he's from England. And so it's a lot later over there.
Yeah, it must be about 10 or
About
9 or
10 o'clock at night, which means his friends and family had to be up quite late to see him speak. But I wanted to introduce him to everybody, maybe get people out of the room back there. But Leon is trained as a nurse in the 1990s in Liverpool and went on to become an acupuncturist, trained in Chinese medicine, gaining a master's at the University of Wales in 2002. So his research led him to rekindle his knowledge of Orgone because his father actually was a pioneering London psychoanalyst who was interested in Reich and Orgonomy. And so he found many, many parallels between Chinese medicine and Reich's theories and did a 72-person double-blind placebo-controlled study in which an effect of the organ accumulators he was able to confirm. So now he does a lot of research and writing on relationship of orgone to consciousness. He's also done a repeat of Reich's Orner experiment in 2017, confirming many of his findings. So he's had various articles published on the Psych Orgone Journal and one in the European Journal of Chinese Medicine. So welcome. I'm glad you're able to come.
Excuse my scruffy top and my hat because I have electrosensitivity, so I've got silver lined clothing. I've managed to make it quite a bit better recently because I had a flare up last year, but I really wanted to attend. So I was thinking maybe the Orgone experiment has made me a bit more sensitive to energies. But I've been doing cold water swimming. So I've been swimming in the Irish Sea once a week.
Wow.
Over the winter.
Wow.
And that's really reduced, well, that reduced my electrosensitivity enough for me to fly over here.
Wow.
Because if I hadn't have managed to get it under control, I wouldn't have been able to come. So, you know.
Well, we're glad you're here.
So tomorrow I'm going to chat about the Orgone repeat of the Orgone experiment that I did, which is Orgone. It's an acronym. Reich loved acronyms, and the Orgone is Orgone OR against nuclear, but the meaning of it is quite expanded from that. But we'll concentrate more on that tomorrow. But today I was just going to try and give an overview of the whole of Orgonomy, the research in it, and also talk a little bit about Orgone and acupuncture, because my dad was started a school of psychoanalysis, and it was probably the main school of psychoanalysis in North London, and his well, he was a Freudian analyst, but Reich was a big part of what he did. So there was always the Orgone books in my dad's library, and so I'd read those, and well, not library, but a whole wall of books he had. And Peter Reich's book was a major influence on me. And then when I got to be a young adult and I got a chance to do a research degree as part of my acupuncture training, I remembered the Orgonomy from childhood, and I knew as a child that Orgone blankets worked because I tried them as a child and got intense dreams from them. Because there was always an Orgone blanket on my dad's psychotherapy. He had an original Freud couch from Vienna, a proper horsehair one with iron wheels, weighs a ton. But some of he did attachment-based analysis, and some of the clients they were very attached to having the room the same. So the Orgone blanket always had to be on the Freud couch.
Mm-hmm.
The cat was allowed in, but everyone else had to be really quiet during therapy. So that was that. And Peter, as a teenager, I read Peter Reich's book because I was playing piano in my dad's room where his books are, and Peter's book, just mainly because of had such a great cover on it. It was a really, not particularly to do with Orgonomy, but it was a cover that appealed to me as a teenager. So that those were the two things that brought me into orgonomy. And Stefan asked me to do an overview of biophysical orgonomy, and I've been working on this for years. Well, I started to do a PhD in orgonomy back in about 2007, 8 maybe, but they didn't want me to do the lab experiments, and I didn't have my mature interest in orgonomy then, so I decided to take the work that I did for the first year of that. I made an annotated bibliography, and then I left it sort of half finished for many years. So if it wasn't for Stefan putting this conference on, I never would have got the impetus I wanted an overview of the entire biophysical research. So I'm only going to today do like a brief overview of an overview, because everything's available on my website. So virtually every major piece of research in all the main areas is there on the website. So any things that come up that you want to follow in more detail, there'll be links for you to do that. And then secondly, I started off looking at orgone and acupuncture, and then with the first year of the PhD, I was just going to say, well, is orgone real? And I wanted to look at cell cultures, but the university got uncomfortable with me doing lab experiments, as that would have probably brought them into conflict with higher institutes, so that they didn't want me to follow that path. But I got the first year made me look systematically at orgonomy. So a systematic review of every experiment in the 4 main areas is there, and the link will follow shortly. This picture that was done by a friend to it's a 3D image of the yin yang symbol. So I thought that was good to unify orgone acupuncture and an overview of the biophysical side. So we can pop on to the next one. So although orgonomic psychiatry is really a biopsychiatry, and you could say the bioelectrical experiments that Reich did very early on, that he was looking at pleasure and pain and whether there was electrical changes with it, and there was. But those are, I've chosen these 4 areas as being the areas to concentrate on for biophysical orgonomy, because they've all got a technological aspect. Like bions, they're a material thing, and they've got 2 technological aspects. They've got the Reich blood test that Armando was talking about, and I have heard of the gentleman at the back that mentioned the other dark field microscopist. I've heard of him. There is a number of dark field microscopists and people even using ultraviolet light to have very high magnifications, and all of those people, they're all working on aspects that are known within orgonomy. They've got very high microscopies, but they're all known. There's nothing that's really outside of orgonomy particularly. They're complementary. So bions were a physical thing that they led to the discovery of, directly led to the discovery of orgone, because like the bioelectrical stuff and the biopsychiatry, they were steps towards bions, because there's pulsation in bions and there's pulsation in emotions. So after those steps, he discovered a whole new layer of microorganism. So the conventional biology kind of starts at cells, but there's a level below cells, between inanimate matter and cells.
Wow.
Before you even get DNA, probably, that I want to ask Armando about DNA creation, whether he's ever seen that in biomes. But there's a whole category missing from biology, and that's where biomes came in. And again, there's complementary scientists in that area. There's about six scientists over the last century who've discovered the same type of things as biomes. There was even a group of Japanese and American researchers who found similar entities and called them biomes. I contacted them and told them, and they were horrified to find out that it was the same term as Reich had used. But so that's why I've put, and I wanted to mention about the Reich blood test, that although it was created in the 1940s, it's still like the dark field live blood analysis, and it's still one of the most, probably the most sophisticated, or two of them. There might be others that are similar, but it's 100 years ahead of its time. It's still ahead of its time now. So that's why I chose biomes. And then we've got biomes led directly to orgone accumulators, because Reich tried to isolate the radiation from biomes, and that led to creating the orgone accumulator. And cloudbusters had a slightly different evolution. And then when I was doing the overview of the whole of Orgonomy, I realized I'll do it mechanically to an extent. Like all the devices that depend on tube-like structures are put into one category. And if you go to that category at the website that will follow, you can see all the research and a synopsis of pretty much every major paper in cloud busting. There was 3 tube devices that the cloud buster came first, trying to get rid of deadly orgone or door. Then the space gun actually came next, and lastly was the medical door buster, which is like a tube-like device to pull door from the body. And then the 4th category is Orgone, which is an energy, but it's got, there is technological sides, like Dr. Blasband made an Orgone lamp that he treated mice with, and then I think it's been used to treat, there's a paper on a skin condition treating that. And an Orgone can be used as it can be used in a technological way. So we can pop on to the next. So Orgonomy as a whole, that I thought about, it's strange that Edgar Casey came to mind when I was thinking, trying to find comparisons, because from one person, that Casey had an enormous amount of material, and Reich's got a similar enormous amount of material. Like he's probably the only subtle energy scientist I know of that's got continual documentation since the late 1930s, early 40s. Like the journals never stopped, even when people were terrified after Reich was killed in prison. The journal writing didn't even stop after that. 1957, 1958, there were still articles being published by Orgonomic Functionalism Journal that was based actually in a town that I've been brought up in, one of the towns that I've lived in. And so there's no interruption in the journal publishing. There's been 3,500 journal articles, papers and books, somewhere around that, maybe 3,500 to 4,000. I've tried to look at what was the quantity of within the literature, and I thought, oh, the biophysical research will be the biggest category, but it wasn't. It's only about 10% of the papers are in like experimental. There's a lot of papers on sociological, historical, science overviews. Then There's somewhere in the region of 400 experimental studies. It was quite hard to count everything up. And I won't just read out all the counts. But as you can see, like 71 studies just in bions, over 150 studies in orgone accumulators, cloudbusters, over 100 studies, even in Orgone, which he only really discovered in the last few years before he passed away, that there's nearly 40 studies. That might not be 40 papers, but say for just, so a lot of the papers were multiple categories, like they might have looked at cloudbusters and orgone accumulators, or they might have looked at bions, using bion water to make plants grow better. So it was quite complex really to count them all up. There's been 2 experimental master's degrees in orgonomy. One's my own, which was looking at the effects of ORACs on acupuncture process. And I was at a private college in York, but that was sponsored by University of Wales. And then James DeMeo, who ran the Orgone Lab Research Centre, an Orgone Research Centre in Oregon. He passed away not too long ago, and he's did an experimental master's in cloud busting. He did want to go on to I'll get to that later. He wanted to go on to a PhD, but that got blocked. There's one postgraduate thesis, and it's not really fair to describe it as a postgraduate thesis because the 2 researchers who did they did 2 random controlled, like considered the gold standard of research in medical research, randomized controlled placebo, having a blinded, double-blinded studies. There's been 3 of those, one my own and 2 German, and it was only published as one postdoctorate thesis, but both of the researchers, Gebauer and Musenich, they're both, it's really a postdoctorate doctorate, because I was very green and naive when I did my own study. I did a full random controlled study for an MSc, and I remember it was way beyond what my college could even mark. I had to get help from outside universities because it was beyond the college just to mark it. They had to give me an extra year to complete it because they couldn't understand the statistics. It was so and I was pretty green. It was amazing that I got statistical significance, because partly it was because it was conducted in such good weather, because the orgone accumulator I used wasn't that strong. But Gebauer and Musenich's work was, I couldn't fault it. If you look through it, it's absolutely perfectly conducted study. I mean, someone could criticize it and say, oh, you only had 30 people or 40 people in a parallel. You can either use parallel methods with random controlled studies, or you can use, I used everyone who went through the process of my study just had one intervention, whereas the German study had 2, they both had the placebo and the experimental. But going through their study, it just, everything was spot on that. One single controlled, but one single blinded medical study, and dozens of controlled studies in plants and mice and devices. And post Reich, I'd say there'd be somewhere in the region of 90 papers that would convert to a higher academic level quite easily. So that a couple of times on the internet, I've heard people say, oh, there's no research for orgone, or there's no evidence for orgone. I mean, people say that about acupuncture. I do part-time acupuncture in an IVF place. We support IVF process in a hospital, and I think the consultants aren't that happy about having Chinese medicine in their hospital unit, but it does boost the numbers and the patients like it. But they've even said, oh, there's no evidence for the acupuncture, so we can't promote you on the hospital website. You'll just have to use your own leaflets. And then so I spent a couple of hours putting all the research together, and there's hundreds of papers, but that equals none if people aren't aware of it. So we can pop on to the next one. Just back one, or oh yeah, we've done that one. Sorry, just we can pop forward. So bions, they were discovered in around about 1939 in Oslo, Norway, and as we were saying earlier, they led to the Reich blood test and the Orgone accumulators. There was a whole bunch of really good quality papers in Reich's lifetime, including by a Canadian biologist called Grad. And post-Reich, because it's quite hard to do bion research, most of the papers are pretty high standard. Some of them have got 7 years of intensive work detailed in one paper, like multiple series of experiments. And every single aspect of the Reich blood test has been confirmed, as Armando was saying, so that there's five aspects of the Reich blood test: the appearance, general appearance, microscopic appearance, the autoclavation reaction when you boil it and see how quickly it disintegrates. And I think there's also culturing tests where you see how many of the T bacilli, the death bion, is produced by the blood sample, or the healthy B reaction bions. And that's really it. Bions we can. The research with the orgone accumulators tends to be more of a mix of research, because it's easier to do pilot studies with it. So there's a lot of papers, somewhere around over 80 papers with orgone accumulators, but at least a couple of dozen of which are of pretty high academic level, and 10 very good academic, and the rest would into the category. The free random mentioned, postdoctorate diploma in Germany, and I had thought that it was only in America that Reich had teams of people around him, but he actually had a team of people supporting him for the bion research in Norway as well. So overall in the orgone accumulator research, been a dozen medical doctors, 4 PhDs, a bunch of professors, academics. I'd really got totally fed up with counting things by there's more than 2 MD holders doing the orgone accumulator research, but I didn't want to go through it again. And 2 medical doctor teams. One, the team that formed around Reich in the US, and disintegrated a little and then reformed around Baker, Dr. Baker. And there was a team of German, Scandinavian doctors. Post Reich, there's also been whole teams of people involved. The researchers are particularly key because they were one cannot say that only people who are very keen on orgonomy of every area of the research. There's been neutral researchers who've also confirmed various orgone effects, and the Turkish researchers were certainly neutral. They weren't orgonomists, and they confirmed aspects of the orgone accumulator. And there's been a Spanish team of physicists who've confirmed Orgone effects. And even within Reich's lifetime, there was neutral researchers who'd confirmed orgone accumulators. There's even hostile researchers who've evidenced orgonomy. The FDA is hostile review of Reich's research found multiple evidence for orgone, and they either, like, they found evidence in burns, and because burns, as has been said earlier, the burns react very quickly to orgone, and it's known there's an electro-Orgone effect. If you put orgone boxes near sources of very strong electricity, you produce a negative energy. And the FDA situated ORACs in their testing by X-ray machines, or not too far from X-ray machines, and that had a negative effect on the mice. And they said that didn't prove anything, but that's totally untrue. It doesn't matter whether you prove something negatively or positively, it's still an effect. And they also evidenced the temperature effect, the FDA, and they said, oh, it's not important. So it was, even hostile researchers have evidenced orgone, which is quite amazing. TO to T, as was said earlier, that's temperature orgone versus temperature. There's been 10 TO to T studies. 4 of them have been in-depth TO to T human studies, 21 highly controlled plant studies, and large mouse studies. I think there was a wound study with 1,600 mice, so over a period of years. I mean, I don't think we particularly need today to do any mice studies or anything, but it was something that was the norm in the 1950s. So that kind of carried on a bit with some of the early doctors into the 70s and 80s. Lots of medical studies, some based just on case studies, but at least over half a dozen medical studies that weren't case studies, and some 25 physical parameter studies. And I was saying confirmation from neutral researchers. We can cloudbusters. I did when I was looking through the research evidence, I was expecting cloudbusters not to be evidenced quite as systematically as they are. But when I actually went through the evidence, I think cloudbusters are probably the best evidence of the 4 types of the 4 areas of biophysical orgonomy. Some 85 papers on cloudbusters since Reich. 7 focused on cloudbusters. Some studies have seen if cloudbusters affect electroscopes, or they affect wound healing or tube-like devices. The majority of the cloudbuster papers, the medical doctors who really focused on cloudbusting in its heyday in the 80s, I think medical doctors, their mindset goes over well to cloudbusting, because looking at a patient, you want to see all the different aspects of a patient, and then looking at an environment, that they approached it the same way, seeing all the different aspects of health and disease in an environment, and then using an intervention to see how that affects the environment. Particularly Dr. Blasband, he became an environmental doctor, really. But something that there is even quantitative analysis within cloudbusting. The one aspect of quantitative analysis that they did was because the Orgone flows west to east and over the whole of the northern hemisphere, but over the America it flows west to east as well. And so they looked at whether they could speed up the weather fronts coming across and use that as a quantitative measure. And they found that they could significantly speed up the number of weather fronts when they're being pulled by cloudbusters when they're coming west to east. So cloudbusters are an amazingly powerful device. Just with there's been some epochal biblical cloudbusting operations. One in Israel where it was they had snow near in the desert and flowers blooming and the new lakes forming. The same thing happened in Eastern Africa, and the Eritrea. To do an operation on that scale, you need a very large cloudbuster, but perhaps with tubes that would go from my feet to the corner of the room, and probably mounted on a truck. And you might need two of those put into a large lake or a very fast-moving river. And there's Israel had biblical changes, which are provable scientifically, because the weather and the patterns, they've been cloud seeding, like dropping chemicals on clouds to try and make rain for years. All the countries around Israel had been doing that, and it failed for years. And then the James Demir was contacted to go across and do a cloud busting operation there, because the Israeli government have known about, well, people in Israel have known about cloud busting since the biblical changes in Israel, those biblical changes in Namibia, and the same in Eritrea over a period of 4 or 5 years. And they actually, the Eritrean and Namibian governments were aware of cloud busting going on, and particularly the Eritrean government supported it because they were saving tens of millions of dollars in imported food. But the West wasn't happy with Eritrea doing this, so they pressured them with. They started to pressure them with people that I think controlled scholars within Eritrea who were being paid from outside Eritrea, and that couldn't persuade the Eritreans to completely stop their support for cloud busting, because the year that they didn't came into pressure, it costing tens of millions of dollars. So they thought, well, to heck with it, we're just going to go ahead and do it. So they restarted it up, and then not long after that, Ethiopia invaded. So when they wouldn't listen to the reason of hostile academics within Eritrea, a war started up very conveniently to bring an end to cloud busting in Africa. It was basically no one would go hungry in Africa if cloud busting was not suppressed. So not anyone. And there's so many different ways of scientifically studying cloud busting. Like Roberto's done a rainfall study in Madagascar, which is a great place to do a rainfall study, because there's a very contained area, and you can see on satellite imagery where the cloud busters have brought rain in above the island. It's very vivid. So it's nearly 80% of Orgone operations, like it's not, you don't just put a cloud buster up and the weather changes instantly. It can be a long process. It can be a very difficult process to change even drought in America, like to a better situation. You might have to draw off the door first, and then redirect streams of energy that are being blocked, you might have to pull a jet stream that's not going over a mountain. You might have to pull it across, and you might have to spend months getting rid of the door over, like some of the work that's been done in Idaho. On one of the rare occasions that someone from the establishment took an interest in cloud busting, they'd even gone so far as to get, was it in the States, you're supposed to register any weather intervention, so that all the people who've done weather intervention have handed it to the NOAA, but that they conveniently lost that data. But the Kellogg Wilson, he was the environmental director of the agricultural department in Idaho. I think it was Idaho, and he took satellite imagery, and he was most impressed at how the cloud busting taking on the satellite imagery.
Yeah, okay.
And I mentioned the epochal changes in those countries, and the successes in Arizona, Israel, Namibia, Eritrea, and Algeria. Work's going on in Algeria very quietly at the moment. And there's a chemical reaction sometimes with cloud busting. If it pulls in a lot of energy, that it can change the composition of rocks nearby. And it's like, because you know the biomes, they're created in the body when cells break down. When if you get really huge amounts of orgone, then it can break down structures of harder materials outside of the body, and so there's a whole chemistry area of orgonomy. The blackening rocks, as Reich called it, that's been confirmed a number of times. Even snowpack's been changed on certain mountains, and twice hurricanes have been steered. There's actually been pretty much, I would say, an energy war going on since 1950. And on one side, you've got governments and corporations that don't want the weather to be better, and they're doing quite fine as it is. And they perhaps even UFOs, because Reich was in two minds about UFOs. That sometimes he thought they create more door in the atmosphere and helped create deserts. But the world that we live in today would be quite different if it wasn't for the decades of battles that the weather doctors have undertaken since during Reich's lifetime and afterwards. Like the German forests would have died. The agriculture in the US would be a lot poorer. Because any nuclear testing, like some people recently have expressed doubts about how real some things are in the world of nuclear technology. But surprisingly, one of the main evidences for nuclear effects are within orgonomy, because the orgonomists are so aware of the energetic effect of the environment that they've recorded quite carefully what the energetic effects have been after nuclear tests. And the nuclear testing really dries out, and it makes the environment armoured. And that's partly why doctors are quite good at interacting with cloud busting, because they see, if they're aware of armouring in a person and they see it in the environment, that they can get a way of interacting with the environment. It's like interacting with the patient and getting the energy flowing again and healing it. Again, there's even in this area, there's confirmation from neutral researchers that I was trying to think of an area that, well, for a single person to have as much journal writing as Wilhelm Reich, the only person I could think of that was similarly outside the mainstream was Casey. But in terms of subtle energy research, I don't know how reliable it is, because I've not managed to check this myself, but people say there's a lot of papers in Russian about torsion field research, which was originally called bioplasma research, basically the same as orgone. I've made Russian style torsion meters myself, and they react to orgone. And in fact, I found an obscure paper, I think in the International Journal for Sex Economy Research. There's a torsion, well, it looks like a torsion field meter. I was going to ask you about it, Roberto.
Which ones?
It's an early IGSO journal, but I'll find it.
Mr. Beans.
I'll say Reich. But he made a kind of torsion field meter, because the Russians have devices that react to subtle energy fields, and one of the torsion field meters they've made is just a bunch of straws, and there's a piece of aluminium foil in a jar, and they can move the foil with the straws, and that's a cloudbuster, because the person is the water, so the person who's holding the straws is grounding the pipes. The straws are the steel pipes of the cloudbuster, and the aluminium foil inside the jar is the clouds. So, and I think there's another group that there's a more formal research that's confirmed aspects of, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it's in my overview. So we can hop on to the next one. Orgonomy. I'm going to do a talk tomorrow just about Orgonomy. So I won't go into it in much detail today. It's basically energized orgone, and there's been a variety of papers that you can see. But if we can just go to these pictures a sec, because I got these two particular pictures out because people had completely different attitudes towards radioactivity from about 1900 to 1950. They thought it was a great thing. There's even like the Marvel comics are based on how and Superman and Spider-Man, it's all based on how brilliant we thought radioactivity was. So up to about 1950, and that's a vessel for making your drinking water radioactive. And the other side is what the needle possibly may have looked like that Reich used in the Orgone setup. So we can go in. I just wanted to say thanks to Stefan for putting this conference together, because there is absolutely no way I would have done this overview if it wasn't for this conference. It took me 3 months of work to make the overview, and the overview itself was partly based on my annotated bibliography, which took me about 2 or 3 years, and combining 2 other bibliographies, so that there's no way I would have got down to doing that otherwise. So Orgonomy, as far as I know, Orgonomy is now the best documented subtle energy science. Well, it's always been the best documented subtle energy science, but it's also a pretty well catalogued science now, even though the biophysical stuff is only 10% of Orgonomy. So if you go to my Substack, Orgone in Consciousness, that's one of the reasons why I'm glad I didn't follow the PhD through at that time, because I didn't have my mature interest in Orgonomy then. I just loved the Orgone research and wanted to investigate whether Orgone was real. But there's no real need for me to do that because the work's already there. So that's why the only missing area for me is how Orgone relates to consciousness. Everything else Reich outlined, but maybe in embryonic form, but he still outlined it. But so that's why my website's termed Orgone Consciousness. So if you go there and just scroll through to the 4 overviews, the overview of number 1, that will give you pretty much a synopsis of every major paper in Bions. The the same with the ORACs, that there might be 2 or 3, and the Orgonomic Functionalism journal's quite rare, and Roberto's just managed to get it digitized, all 2,000 pages of it. So I'll go through, and there's 1 or 2 pages that I haven't synopsized, but virtually all of them. So I'll be adding to these, the odd 1 or 2 over the next few months.
Please, I'm afraid to what time.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to talk about acupuncture?
Yeah. So if we go on to the next one. So this was Bernstein was the first person to put Orgone and acupuncture together about 1979, or the late 70s. He was a German professor, a great guy. And although his study was a pilot study, it was done really well. It was a very well conducted pilot study, because you don't need to prove everything at that level. You just want to see, is there an effect? Should it investigate it more? And there was. And he used you can make very simple medical doorbusters, and this is about as simple as it gets. Just an iron tube with a lead going into water. And you put that on acupuncture points that need to have energy withdrawn from them. And then there's a plaster there that you can, the best point on the body for charging chi is Ren 6, which is just below the belly button. And so you could put an Orgone plaster on Ren 6. And the Orgone acupuncture tubes are amazing things for research. I use them in my consciousness research. You can just hold them over an acupuncture point. Right, we can move on to the next one. Then there's a guy called Dr. Inza. He's an amazingly eclectic practitioner in Argentina. I tried to contact him before this conference, but I didn't manage to get hold of him. But he uses Orgone acupuncture tube. That's a Dr. Inza style tube. And a door busting tube, and he measures different points to see where they're stuck according to the Reichian segments. So we can move on to the next one. This is my own work. A research friend of mine in the early 2000s, he took some of the Orgone acupuncture accumulating box, and there's a medical door busting box. It's too strong for Europeans generally. It's okay with Africans and Aboriginals, but when I've used it on, well, maybe I find it okay with people in America, but when I've used it I've used it in drug rehab clinics in Liverpool, and it's too strong for people. But I might play with like your teacher a little bit, and there's a pad for directly connecting it without needles. I prefer to use needles, so so we can move on to the next one. And Francesco D'Angelo, he's, as Roberto was saying, that he's done created a different type of Orgone device that's got a tube rather than my one's got a wire that attaches either to a needle or to a little button that you can put on without a needle. He's hoping to get more of a balancing effect occurring between the person and the Orgone accumulator, so it doesn't overpower the point or the channel. But he's got an Orgone accumulator there in the tubes that connects to points, and he's had some success with quite complex cases. But and that's pretty much it, really.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.